Are you sure? He asked, his voice just loud enough to hear. I'm sure, I panted, my heart pounding wildly. I've never wanted anything more. With that affirmation, Chris leaned in again, our lips meeting in a heated kiss. I felt myself melting into him, my body reacting instinctively to the heat between us. I threaded my fingers through his hair, pulling him closer. As the kiss intensified, the sofa beneath us seemed to transform into its own world, as we explored each other, lost in our own desires. Chris's hand slid down to my waist, gripping tightly but gently, pulling me closer still. I felt a rush of excitement mixed with fear, the thrill of the forbidden only fueling my desire. The afternoon sun bathed the living room in gold, the warm light reflecting off everything as I moved around the new house. A few months after my wedding to David, I was still getting used to my new life, especially my role as stepmother to Chris, his 19-year-old son. Things weren't easy. My relationship with Chris was complicated, filled with unspoken emotions. Although I had tried to connect with him, an invisible wall always existed between us. Chris had messy, dark brown hair that framed his masculine, angular face. His build was solid, the result of years of playing high school football. He was charming and confident, but sometimes I caught a glimpse of something very vulnerable hidden beneath that exterior. Our conversations usually revolved around superficial topics, missing deeper emotions, leaving me yearning for a connection that was both intense and wrong. One afternoon, as I was preparing dinner, Chris's laughter echoed from the living room. Curious, I peeked in. He was sitting on the sofa, engrossed in playing video games with his friends. The image warmed my heart, but at the same time stirred a strange feeling. I wanted to close the gap between us, but struggled with the boundaries this relationship imposed. Chris, dinner's almost ready, I called out, trying to keep my tone light. Yeah, I'll be right there, he replied, his eyes still glued to the screen. As I stirred the simmering sauce on the stove, a feeling of both anticipation and anxiety washed over me. I wondered how to connect with him, how to make him feel like he was part of the family. Just then, the doorbell rang. I was surprised to see David standing there, his arms full of grocery bags. I wanted to surprise you, he said with a smile as he came in. I picked up some ingredients for dessert. Great. I just finished preparing dinner, I replied, my heart warming at the sight of my husband. David set the bags down and began rummaging through them. I even got your favorite ice cream. We're going to have a nice family evening tonight, he said. Sounds good, I smiled, feeling grateful for these simple moments. While we finished dinner together, my mind drifted back to Chris. I hoped this new dynamic would help us grow closer. After we finished cooking, David called Chris down for dinner. Dinner's ready, David called out. Chris walked into the dining room with a slight smile on his lips. What smells so good? He asked. Your favorite, spaghetti, I replied, serving him a generous portion. As we sat down at the table, I couldn't help but notice the way Chris's eyes flickered between David and me. There was an intensity in his gaze, a lingering curiosity that made my heart beat faster. After dinner, we moved to the living room to begin our family evening. David suggested watching a movie, and I curled up on the sofa next to him, feeling the warmth radiating from his body. Chris sat across from us, looking somewhat distant, his eyes fixed on the TV screen. As the movie began, I felt David's hand rest on my thigh, a familiar gesture that made me smile. I leaned into him, enjoying the connection between husband and wife, but a small part of me remained aware of Chris's presence. The thought of him watching us made me feel both anxious and excited. Midway through the movie, David got up to get more popcorn. I glanced over at Chris, who seemed lost in thought. I sensed a tension in the air, one that both thrilled and frightened me. You okay? I asked softly, trying to gauge his mood. Yeah, just thinking, Chris replied, avoiding my eyes. About what? I asked, wanting to draw him into the conversation. Just things, he said, finally looking at me. Just getting used to things. I nodded, feeling a wave of sympathy wash over me. I understand, it can be difficult sometimes. I want you to know I'm always here if you need to talk. For a moment, our eyes met, and I felt a wordless connection, a thread of understanding binding us together. Just then, David returned with the bowl of popcorn and sat down beside me. "What did I miss?" he asked. "Just girl talk," I replied, winking at Chris. The movie continued, but my mind lingered on the moment I had just shared with Chris. It was dangerous territory, but there was also something very thrilling about it. As the final credits rolled, David got up and stretched. "I'm going to bed. You two can stay up a little longer if you want." "Good night, Dad," Chris said, waving casually. "Good night, Chris." "Good night, Sarah," David said, placing a light kiss on my cheek before disappearing down the hallway. As soon as David was out of sight, the atmosphere changed completely. I felt Chris's eyes fixed on me, making my pulse quicken. "Want to watch another movie?" I asked, trying to keep things casual. "Sure," Chris replied, but he didn't move. Instead, he turned towards me, placing his arm on the back of the sofa, a subtle shift that made my heart race. We chose another movie, but I found it hard to concentrate. Chris's presence was overwhelmingly captivating, and the way he leaned closer to me carried an indescribable energy. The moment the movie started, I felt the heat between us intensify. As the story unfolded on the screen, I caught Chris glancing at me. My stomach tightened with nervousness, and I knew I shouldn't be thinking about him this way, but the closer we sat, the more the line between stepmother and stepson blurred. Suddenly, the climax of the movie delivered an unexpected jump scare, and instinctively, I flinched, falling back against Chris. He looked at me, surprise evident in his eyes, and before I knew it, he reached out and took my hand, squeezing it gently. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice deep and soothing. I felt my heart quicken, the warmth from his hand spreading through me like an electric current. I could feel the heat radiating from him, and I had to suppress the urge to lean in closer, to let the moment carry me away. The movie continued, but my mind was completely consumed by the connection we were sharing. It was intense, and I could see desire flickering in Chris's eyes. I yearned to close the distance between us, to explore what lay beneath the surface of this relationship. As the final credits rolled, I turned to Chris, my heart pounding. "You know, it's really nice having you here," I said softly. "Yeah," he replied, his gaze lingering on my lips. "I like being with you, Sarah." A shiver ran down my spine. Encouraged by his words, I responded, "Me too." Then, without thinking, I leaned in closer, drawn to him like a magnet. Our lips were only inches apart, and I could see the conflict in his eyes, mirroring the conflict within myself. "Chris," I began, my voice trembling. "We shouldn't, I know," he interrupted, his hot breath fanning my skin, "but I can't help how I feel." Before I could react, he closed the gap between us, claiming my lips in a kiss that ignited everything within me. The moment was overwhelming, and I felt myself melting into him, responding with the same passion. Chris's hand threaded through my hair as he deepened the kiss, sending waves of desire crashing through my body. It was forbidden, yet exhilarating, and I couldn't stop myself. Each kiss fueled a new fire, leaving me craving more. When we finally pulled away, we were both breathless, my heart racing with a mix of fear and excitement. "We can't do this," I whispered, my voice shaky. "I want to," Chris said, his eyes darkening with desire. "I've wanted this for a long time." I felt a mixture of longing and guilt. "This is complicated. We're family." "Maybe we're more than family," Chris suggested, his voice thick with emotion. "Maybe we can be something special." My heart pounded as I processed his words. The thrill of the forbidden made my pulse race, but I also felt the weight of the consequences. "What if this ruins everything?" I asked softly. "I don't care," he said, stepping closer to me. "I don't want to hide how I feel anymore." With that, he leaned in again, capturing my lips in another heated kiss. This time, I didn't hesitate, I melted into him. Their kisses grew more urgent and heated. Chris's hands caressed my back, pulling me closer until our bodies were pressed together. I felt myself giving in, the boundaries I had tried to maintain crumbling with each touch. I felt alive, and the desire was truly overwhelming. "I've never felt like this before," Chris whispered between kisses, his hot breath on my skin. "Me neither," I admitted, my heart pounding. "It feels so right and so wrong." "Don't think about that right now," he murmured, kissing me again, his lips moving across mine with urgency. As we kissed, the world around us seemed to vanish. My hands found their way to Chris's chest, feeling the warmth of his body beneath my fingers. I was lost in the sensation, my heart pounding as I gave into the moment. Chris's touch was overwhelming, igniting a fire within me that I had never known. As our kisses deepened, Chris pulled back slightly, his eyes searching mine, filled with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice just loud enough to hear. "I'm sure," I panted, my heart pounding wildly. "I've never wanted anything more." With that affirmation, Chris leaned in again, our lips meeting in a heated kiss. I felt myself melting into him, my body reacting instinctively to the heat between us. I threaded my fingers through his hair, pulling him closer. As the kiss intensified, the sofa beneath us seemed to transform into its own world, as we explored each other, lost in our own desires. Chris's hand slid down to my waist, gripping tightly but gently, pulling me closer still. I felt a rush of excitement mixed with fear, the thrill of the forbidden only fueling my desire. "Sarah," Chris whispered against my lips, his voice husky with emotion, "you make me feel alive." My heart swelled at his words. I knew the risks we were taking, but in that moment, the connection we shared was too powerful to resist. "You make me feel the same way," I admitted, feeling a wave of vulnerability wash over me, a feeling that was both right and wrong. "Don't think about that right now," he murmured, kissing me again, his lips moving across mine with urgency. After the kiss, a silence hung in the room. Our breaths were still heavy. I looked into Chris's eyes, trying to find an answer, some reassurance, but saw only a mix of confusion and longing. I knew I had crossed a line, one I never thought I would. Guilt washed over me, but at the same time, I couldn't deny the powerful emotion I had just experienced. We can't do this," I whispered, my voice trailing off. I could feel the tremor in my own voice, a tremor not just of fear, but also because a part of me didn't want to stop. Chris didn't answer right away. He looked at me, his eyes holding something that made my heart ache. "Why not?" he finally said, his voice husky. "You feel it too, Sarah." I looked down, avoiding his gaze. I knew he was right. I had felt it, for a long time. But that didn't make it right. "David, he's your father," I said, my voice choked. "He trusts you." Chris gently lifted my chin, forcing me to look into his eyes. "I know," he said, his voice soft but firm. "But you're not just my stepmother. You're more than that." I looked deep into his eyes, and in that moment, I saw something that made my heart melt. It wasn't just desire, but also loneliness, vulnerability, and a longing to be loved. I saw myself in his eyes, my own loneliness, my own yearning for connection, and my own fear of what could happen. I remained silent, not knowing what to say. I knew this was wrong, that it could destroy everything. But at the same time, I felt a powerful pull, an urge to be close to him, to share the emotions I had buried for so long. Chris gently placed his hand on my cheek, his thumb lightly stroking my skin. "Are you scared?" he asked, his voice full of concern. I nodded, tears starting to well up in my eyes. "I'm terrified," I admitted. "I'm scared of what people will think, I'm scared of what David will think. But most of all, I'm scared of what will happen to us." Chris pulled me into a hug, holding me tightly. "I'm scared too," he whispered in my ear. "But I don't want to lose you." In his arms, I felt a strange comfort. I knew this was a dangerous path, but I also knew I couldn't turn back. After that, we sat in silence for a long time, only the sound of our soft breathing echoing in the room. I felt the warmth from Chris's body, and a strange sense of peace crept into my soul. But that peace was also accompanied by a constant worry, a worry about the future, about the secrets we were now sharing. "What are we going to do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Chris pulled back slightly, looking at me with a serious expression. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "But I know I don't want to hide how I feel anymore. I want to be with you, Sarah. Whatever that means." Chris's words made my heart race. I knew this decision would change my life forever. But in that moment, I felt a powerful urge, an urge to be true to my feelings. "Me too," I whispered. "But we need to do the right thing." After those words, a heavy silence filled the room. Chris looked at me, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. I knew he understood what I meant. We were standing at a crucial crossroads in our lives, and the path we chose would determine the future of everyone. The following days passed like a nightmare. I lived in constant torment and anxiety. Every time David hugged me, I felt a wave of guilt wash over me. I knew I was deceiving him, the man I loved and respected. I tried to act normal, but I knew that David had begun to notice a change in me. He looked at me with suspicion, and his casual questions made my heart clench. Chris and I avoided each other as much as possible. We no longer had those pleasant conversations in the living room, nor those meaningful glances. Whenever we accidentally met, we only exchanged fleeting glances, full of pain and regret. One evening, when David was away on a business trip, I was sitting alone in the living room, looking out the window. It was raining heavily, the raindrops pattering against the glass like sighs. I felt lonely and desperate. Just then, there was a knock at the door. I knew it was Chris. I opened the door, and he stepped into the room. We both sat in silence for a moment, neither of us saying anything. The atmosphere in the room was heavy and suffocatingly tense. "Sarah," Chris finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "I can't keep doing this." I looked at him, tears starting to well up in my eyes. "I know," I whispered. "Me neither." "What are we going to do?" Chris asked, his voice full of despair. I shook my head, not knowing how to answer. I knew we had to make a decision, but I didn't know which was the right path. "I love you," Chris said, his voice trembling. "Do you love me?" Chris's question made my heart ache. I knew the answer, but I was afraid to admit it. I was afraid of the consequences it would bring. I love you too," I whispered. The confession echoed in the silent room, like a thunderclap. Chris's face lit up, then quickly dimmed, replaced by a deep sadness. He knew, I knew, this love was a forbidden luxury, a fire smoldering beneath the ashes of family ties. "So what do we do?" Chris's voice was choked, as if begging for an answer that neither of us had. I shook my head, tears streaming down my cheeks. I didn't know. I truly didn't know. I only knew that each passing day was a torment, a constant battle between my heart and my mind. The following days were a series of furtive moments, stolen glances, brief conversations in the dark. We were like thieves, stealing fleeting moments together, living in constant fear of being discovered. I began to feel distant from David. Every time he touched me, I cringed. I felt a wave of guilt surging, like a wave drowning me in lies. I tried to appear normal, but I knew he had noticed the change. His gaze towards me grew increasingly suspicious, his questions more pointed. I felt like I was walking on a tightrope, one small misstep could send me plummeting into the abyss. One night, when David was fast asleep, I quietly got out of bed and went downstairs to the living room. Chris was sitting there, looking out the window. The moonlight illuminated his face, highlighting his angular features and melancholic eyes. I sat down beside him, saying nothing. We both sank into silence, with only the sound of rain pattering against the windowpane. I can't take it anymore, Chris whispered, his voice trembling. I can't live like this anymore. I knew he was right. I couldn't take it either. This lie was gnawing at my heart, making it hard to breathe. Me neither, I said, my voice choked. I can't either. What are we going to do? He asked, his voice full of despair. I looked deep into his eyes, trying to find an answer, but saw only deadlock and pain. I don't know, I confessed, my voice faltering. I really don't know. Chris stood up, walking closer to me. He gently took my hand, his hands trembling. I love you, he said, his voice shaking. I'm wronging David, but I can't deny my feelings for you. I was silent, not knowing what to say. His confession was like a fire erupting in my heart, burning away all the barriers of reason. I loved him too, deeply and intensely, but I knew this love was wrong, forbidden. I love you too, I whispered, the confession heavy with remorse. Chris's eyes flickered between joy and pain. In that moment, time seemed to stand still. Then Chris pulled me into a hug, a tight, desperate embrace. I leaned against his chest, feeling his heart beating faster than usual. In his arms, there was a brief moment of comfort, but also boundless fear. Then Chris took a step back, looking directly into my eyes. We can't continue like this, he said, his voice firm but full of pain. We have to make a decision. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. I know. We have 3 choices, Chris said, his voice catching. 1. We end everything right now, forget everything that's happened, and try to live our lives as before. I shook my head, tears falling more freely. I knew it was the right choice, but I didn't know if I could do it. 2. Chris continued, his voice trembling, we continue this relationship in secret, accepting to live in lies and fear of being discovered. But I'm not sure how long we can endure it. I was silent, this choice sounded dark and full of risk. And the last choice, Chris said, his voice fading, is to tell David the truth. The last choice Chris offered hung heavily in the air, weighty and terrifying. I felt a chill run down my spine. Tell David the truth. The thought horrified me. I imagined his face, the shattered trust, the disappointment and pain evident in his eyes. I couldn't do that to him, I couldn't destroy my marriage, couldn't hurt the man I had vowed to love and cherish for life. I can't, I whispered, my voice almost inaudible. I can't do that to him. I can't, I whispered, my voice almost inaudible. I can't do that to him. Chris looked at me, his eyes full of pain. I know, he said. But I don't know if we can live with this secret forever. I was silent, looking down. I knew he was right. This secret was eating away at both of us, little by little. It was poisoning my soul, filling me with guilt and remorse. I knew Chris was right. This secret was like a ticking time bomb, counting down to the day it would explode, shattering everything around it. I pulled away from Chris's embrace, walking to the window, looking out at the dark night. The rain continued to fall, heavy drops falling as if pouring out all the sadness of the world. I felt so small and lost in this vast world. I need time, I said, my voice as soft as a breeze. I need time to think. Chris said nothing, just silently looked at me. I knew he understood. We both needed time to face this truth, to consider the options and prepare for the consequences. The following days passed in heaviness and tension. I tried to avoid Chris, but every time I saw him, my heart ached. I knew I loved him, but I also knew that this love was wrong, forbidden. I began to think about David. He was a good man, a wonderful husband. He loved me and trusted me unconditionally. I didn't want to hurt him, but I also didn't know how to escape this mess. One evening, when David returned from his business trip, I decided to talk to him. I knew this was a difficult decision, but I couldn't continue living in lies any longer. I sat across from David in the living room, taking a deep breath to calm myself. David, I began, my voice trembling, there's something I need to tell you. David looked at me, his eyes gentle and caring. What is it, sweetheart? He asked. I looked into his eyes, trying to find a glimmer of hope, a sign that everything would be okay. But I only saw trust and love, which made me feel even more guilty. I took a deep breath, preparing to tell the truth, but just then, the phone rang. David answered it, and after a few minutes of conversation, he turned to me with a worried expression. I have to go, he said. There's an emergency at work. I nodded, feeling a small sense of relief at having postponed this difficult moment. But I also knew I couldn't run away forever. The truth would eventually come out. The next morning, I decided to talk to Chris again. I needed an answer, a direction. I couldn't continue living in this lie and torment any longer. I found Chris in David's study. He was sitting by the window, looking out at the backyard. I entered the room, and he turned to look at me. Have you thought it over? He asked, his voice soft. I nodded, taking a deep breath. I think we should end it, I said, my voice trembling. Chris's face fell. You're serious? He asked, his voice full of pain. I looked into his eyes, tears welling up. I don't want to hurt David, I said. I can't destroy my marriage. Chris looked at me, his eyes shimmering as if filled with words he wanted to say but didn't dare utter. A long moment passed, with only the ticking of the clock in the corner of the room marking the time. Finally, he gave a faint smile, a smile I had never seen before, painful, yet resigned. I understand, he said, his voice hoarse as if choked. I felt my heart clench. I wanted to walk over to him, but my legs felt like lead. I knew I shouldn't. Any touch would only make things harder. That evening, the sky outside was pitch black, with only a few faint stars flickering in the night sky. I sat in the living room, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, a feeling of unease like a huge wave crashing against my chest. The light from the pale yellow ceiling lamp reflected off the walls, making everything seem smaller, further increasing the stuffiness in the space. David sat across from me, intently watching a program on TV, but his eyes occasionally flicked over to me. He must have noticed the abnormality in my silence, the way I kept looking down, avoiding his gaze. I knew I couldn't delay any longer. The confessions kept swirling in my head, but I didn't know where to begin. I tried to gather my courage, but every time I was about to speak, the image of Chris appeared in my mind. His eyes, the mixed emotions I had left behind, all like knives stabbing straight into me. But this was David, the one who had always been by my side, always loved and trusted me unconditionally. I couldn't keep hiding it from him. I took a deep breath, lifting my eyes to look at him, the man I had vowed to be with for life. I began, my voice trembling. There's something I need to tell you. David looked at me, his eyes gentle and caring. What is it, sweetheart? He asked. I took another deep breath, trying to regain my composure. I stammered, the words stuck in my throat. How could I say this terrible truth? How could I look him in the eye and confess my betrayal? Just then, the doorbell rang, interrupting my inner turmoil. David let go of me and went to open the door. When he returned, behind him was a young, beautiful woman. She looked at David with a look that was both worried and intimate. David, she said, her voice slightly trembling, I need to talk to you. I froze. I felt like a rock was weighing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Who was this woman? And why did she need to talk to my husband privately? A bad premonition suddenly struck me, making me feel dizzy. David turned back to look at me, his face pale. He stammered, Sarah, this is Emily. Emily is my sister, David said, his voice choked. A heavy silence filled the room. I looked at Emily, then back at David, trying to understand what was happening. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner, David said, his voice full of regret. It's a complicated story, and I didn't know how to tell you. I nodded, trying to appear calm. I understand, I said, but my heart was filled with doubts. Then I looked directly into David's eyes, my voice becoming firm. But there's something else, I said. Something more important. I need to tell you. David looked at me, his eyes full of worry. What is it, Sarah? He asked. I took a deep breath, trying to suppress the tears that were threatening to spill. It's about Chris, I said, my voice trembling. David's face changed. He looked at me with a bewildered expression. Chris? What about Chris? He asked. I looked deep into his eyes, and I knew that this was the moment. I had to tell the truth, no matter how painful it was. Chris and we've had a relationship. Space seemed to freeze. David's face turned white. He looked at me, his eyes full of shock, pain, and fury. What are you saying? He stammered, his voice trembling. I looked at him, tears streaming down my face. I'm sorry, I whispered. I'm so sorry. A deathly silence enveloped the room. David looked at me, as if he were looking at a complete stranger. Then, suddenly, anger erupted in him. A relationship? He roared, his voice full of hatred. You dare call it a relationship? It's betrayal. Disgusting betrayal. I took a step back, frightened by his anger. I had never seen him like this. I trusted you, he continued, his voice shaking with anger. I trusted you more than anyone in the world. And this is how you repay me? I couldn't say anything. I just stood there, tears falling like rain. I knew I was wrong, I had hurt him deeply. With my son? David roared, his voice full of contempt. With Chris? You slept with my son? Those words were like knives stabbing into my heart. I felt ashamed and humiliated. No, I whispered, my voice choked. It's not what you think. It's not like that. But David didn't hear me. His anger had clouded his reason. Liar, he shouted. You're a liar. You deceived me, you deceived Chris too. He turned and walked away, slamming the living room door. I heard him slam the front door, then the sound of his car starting and speeding off into the rainy night. I collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. I knew that everything was over. My marriage was broken, and I had lost the man I loved. David had left. The sound of his car gradually faded into the rainy night. I collapsed to the floor, hot tears streaming down my cheeks. His anger, his bitter accusations, all like knives stabbing into my heart. I felt terrible, a betrayer, a failed wife. I remembered Chris's words, we have to make a decision. And I had chosen. I had chosen to end the relationship with him, for David, for my marriage. But was it the right decision? Was burying this secret the best way? These thoughts continued to besiege me, making me feel suffocated and breathless. I had hurt both of the men I loved. I had betrayed David, and I had broken Chris's heart. I stood up, staggering into the bedroom. The room was empty and cold, reflecting my own mood. I looked at the bed, where David and I had once shared happy moments. Now, it was just a symbol of loss and regret. I lay down on the bed, hugging the pillow tightly. Memories flooded back, the smiles, the hugs, the loving words. All of it was now just the past, a past that I had destroyed with my own hands. I remembered the moment I confessed to David. His face, from gentle and caring to shocked, pained, then furious. His eyes, from trusting and loving to hateful and disappointed. I felt like I had been stripped of everything, stripped of both my self-respect and love. Tears kept falling non-stop. I felt regret, remorse, and utter loneliness. I had lost everything, and I didn't know how to heal these wounds. I wondered, would David ever forgive me? Would I ever forgive myself? The answer seemed to be shrouded in deep darkness. The following days were a series of long, drawn-out days in silence and distance. David avoided me, he didn't talk to me, nor did he look me in the eye. I felt like I was living in a strange house, with a strange man. I tried to talk to him, explain, beg for forgiveness, but he either remained silent or only answered with short, curt sentences. The invisible wall between us grew thicker, higher, separating two hearts that had once beat in unison. The family dinners we used to have, with lively laughter, now became silent, heavy meals. Chris also sensed the change, he became less talkative and more withdrawn. I knew he was also suffering, tormented, but neither of us dared to talk about what had happened. One evening, I was clearing the table after a typically silent dinner. David sat in the living room, his eyes glued to the TV screen, but I knew he wasn't watching. I walked over to him, trying to touch his hand, but he pulled his hand away. "David," I called to him, my voice trembling. "I'm sorry. I know I was wrong." "Don't say anything," he interrupted me, his voice cold. "I don't want to hear anything from you anymore." I was silent, tears threatening to spill. I felt helpless and desperate. I had hurt him too deeply, to the point of no repair. In the following days, the situation worsened. David avoided me even more. He often came home late, or didn't come home at all. I lived in the large house alone, feeling lonelier and more lost than ever. One morning, I woke up and found a piece of paper on the kitchen table. It was divorce papers. I picked up the paper, my hand trembling. The words printed on the paper were like knives stabbing into my heart. I felt the world around me collapsing. David had decided. He had decided to end our marriage. I sank into a chair, tears streaming down my face. I knew this was the ending I had to bear, but I still couldn't believe that everything had ended like this. The divorce papers lay on the kitchen table, white, cold, and soulless. The dry legal language was like knives, cutting into my heart. I picked it up, my hand shaking, tears rolling down my cheeks. My marriage, which I had once cherished and nurtured, was now just a piece of paper, ready to be torn apart. I remembered the day David proposed to me. He had knelt down, giving me the sparkling ring and saying sweet words of love. I had believed that our love would last forever. But now, it was all shattered. The following days were a series of complicated and stressful legal procedures. Meetings with lawyers, arguments about assets, all made me tired and weary. David and I barely spoke to each other, except for matters related to the divorce. His gaze towards me remained cold and distant, as if I were a complete stranger. I moved out of the house we had once shared. Packing my belongings, looking at familiar objects, souvenir photos, made my heart ache. I remembered the happy moments we had once shared in this place, and I felt regret for having lost everything. I moved to a small, one-person apartment. The apartment was empty and cold, reflecting my own mood. I felt lonely and lost, as if I were drifting in the open sea. During the long nights, I couldn't sleep. The memories of David and Chris haunted me. I wondered if I had done right or wrong. Could I forgive myself? I also thought about Chris. I wondered where he was, what he was doing. I missed the moments we were together, the stolen kisses, the loving words. I knew we couldn't go back to the way things were, but I still couldn't forget him. The divorce process lasted a few months. Every time I met David at the courthouse, I felt a sharp pain in my heart. He was no longer the man I had once loved. He had become cold and distant, as if I were his enemy. Finally, the day of the verdict arrived. David and I stood before the judge, listening to the divorce pronouncements. Upon hearing those words, I felt an immense sense of loss. My marriage was officially over. After the court hearing, David turned and walked away, not looking back at me once. I stood there, watching his figure disappear, tears streaming down my face. I knew I had lost him forever. I walked out of the courthouse with an empty feeling. Everything was over. My marriage, the life I had once dreamed of, had all vanished into thin air. I was alone, completely alone. The small apartment I rented became my refuge. The four cold walls surrounded me, witnessing the long nights I tossed and turned sleeplessly, the silent tears that fell. I tried to find a new job, a new beginning, but everything was difficult. Job applications were repeatedly rejected, failed interviews made me feel discouraged and desperate. I missed David. I missed his smile, his warm voice, his tight hugs. I missed the evenings we cooked together, watched movies together, shared stories of joy and sorrow. All of it was now just painful memories. I also thought about Chris. I wondered where he was, what he was doing. I knew that I had hurt him deeply, and I felt regret for that. But I also knew that I couldn't go back to the past. The days and months passed heavily. I tried to pull myself together every morning, trying to find a reason to continue living. I started exercising, joined a few cooking classes, tried to meet friends. But no matter how hard I tried, I still felt a large void in my heart. It was all my fault. If I had been stronger, if I had been more clear-headed, if I had been able to control my momentary emotions, then none of this would have happened. The answer was always a sharp pain in my heart. I was wrong. I was wrong to let myself fall into Chris's arms. I didn't know what the future would hold. I didn't know if I would ever find happiness again. But I knew that I would never forget this lesson. It would be a part of me, a scar reminding me of past mistakes, and also a motivation for me to become a better person in the future.